Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Galstian, and I'd like to welcome you to Todd Williamson in conversation with Priscilla Fraser. Before we start, I would like to make this discussion as interactive as possible, so please feel free to submit any questions you have by using the Q&A function on your consoles. Todd Williamson has been a vital part of the California School of Abstraction. The Pollock Krasner Foundation awarded him the Pollock Prize for Creativity. This was the third time the prize has ever been awarded, and the full $50,000 reward was directed towards his exhibition, Processional, at last year's Venice Biennale. In partnership with the MAK Center for Art and Architecture, and curated by the MAK's director, Priscilla Fraser, Processional was presented at Vivaldi's chapel, the Chiesa di Santa Maria della Pieta, located on the Grand Canal. Todd Williamson has exhibited extensively in the U.S. and abroad, including the Palm Springs Art Museum, Stencil, Villa Di Donato, and Mocha. Priscilla Fraser is the director of the MAK Center for Art and Architecture at the Schindler House in LA. Prior to this position, he was senior architect and project manager at LACMA. Well recognized for designing notable installations like Chris Burden's Metropolis 2 and the James Turrell Retrospective, Priscilla joined architect Peter Zumthor to oversee multiple teams working on his forthcoming LACMA redesign. She has also served as Director of Exhibitions and Publications with Stephen Hull Architects and worked under Barry Bergdahl in the Architecture Department at MoMA. So thank you, Priscilla and Todd, for being here. Let's go ahead and start.
Thank you and thanks for the introduction. I guess we were all in a very different place this time last year, but I'm happy to be together again, virtually at least now. Todd, I just wanted to give the audience a little bit of an overview of what you and I had discussed covering today, if that's okay with you, just to get things started. I know that you and Robert had a discussion recently, largely about the content of our exhibition, Processional, and your practice, as well as what you're working on today. So while I'm sure this discussion will cover those topics and go into our exhibition in greater detail, I think that part of what we wanted to focus on was perhaps more of the pragmatics, and logistics that go into participating in something like the Venice Biennale, and perhaps using that discussion as a platform to more broadly address the topic of art fairs, the topic of exposure, especially in the context of what's going on today.
Yeah, and I think that it's important that the people that are listening, please, do the question and answers, pipe in. It would be a more interesting discussion if we all have something to say, and I think we do.
For sure. So I guess maybe it's best for me with kind of in telling the story or narrative of the Venice Biennale last year and our participation together, to discuss how we became involved and perhaps hear a little bit more of what was going on before our involvement. The MAK Center was, of course, thrilled to be invited to partner with you through you and Robert in the preparation and planning for this exhibition. Since we are a small nonprofit institution, we, of course, came at it from that perspective. But as we've discussed, the Venice Biennale and art fairs in general are largely a platform for sales and exposure for the individual artists. So while we were brought into this discussion in December, I know that you had previously been planning your involvement and, of course, had previous exhibitions and connections to Italy. And I'm wondering how that informed your process and really where things began even prior to our involvement.
Well, I think the logistics of doing anything in Venice is so difficult. And for me, I had shown in Italy enough to where I understood a lot of the logistics. So in preparing for this, we did this on such a shoestring budget too. The art itself and what we did with the music and the paintings cost a fraction of the budget for the Biennale, which most people think is paid for by the Biennale. And as you know, that's all us doing. So it was that for me was the most difficult thing and also the good thing about having been there so many times. And plus I had a lot of friends there. My friends, the Pennas that live in Naples, helped me so I could sit in paintings rolled. And then I hired someone to create frames. So we did everything in the church on site, and that saved me a tremendous amount of money in shipping.
Yes. Yeah. I feel like you really just officially moved into Italy and Venice in particular during this whole process, which I think was also part of what made the ultimate exhibition feel so of the space, of the time, and certainly the topic of the Biennale itself, which now feels like they had a crystal ball last summer, which may you live in interesting times, and in a sense, I think that you did as well. Of course, the paintings included in Processional, you had been working on previous to the exhibition, and you'd been working on for a while, as far as I understood, and really considered these works of abstract expressionism to be portraits of significant figures in contemporary culture, and we're examining the impact of individuals, both positive and negative, largely through words, and even more specifically through social media. So we had a fun time talking about that impact and talking about that cultural phenomenon, looking at people from Elon Musk, whose quote we see here, to Oprah, to even Kylie Jenner.
Priscilla?
Can you remind us what the full quote means?
The Elon Musk quote is, it's okay to put all of your eggs in one basket as long as you control the basket.
Classic, yeah. Especially doing California.
On your part, though, to come up with this, all these quotes in Latin within the context of the church and the architecture, it was so perfect.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that you had such a clear vision, and your work was so inspiring. But then when we started talking together about what perhaps the MAK Center could bring to the space or to the experience, since our entire practice is about highlighting and celebrating historically significant architecture and looking at the power of art in those contexts, it was important to us to really think about the Santa Maria della Pieta, the history of that specific chapel, the focus on apostles. We even started drawing a bit of a parallel between the figures that were the focus of your portraits and this concept of apostles. And I think the idea of your imagined portraits really resonated with us in our examination of how we could stretch the concept into context. Thinking about how, in in the 1700s and earlier, people really didn't know what religious figures looked like exactly, and so they had to imagine based on the words that they were sharing. And I felt that was somewhat similar to your process of envisioning these portraits. So I think what we're always striving for is to sort of delete that line between art and architecture, and I feel that this installation was a successful delineation of that separation.
Yeah. And the architecture also played some of the most difficult, it will present the biggest difficulties in the exhibition, because it was historical, not being able to touch the architecture anyway. No nails, you only holes in the walls that already existed. So getting there, we didn't really know what that was.
Right. You can't really know all the all the specifics and full character, perhaps, of a space quite like that until you're there. And I think it's also worth mentioning that's part of what I think what makes the Collateral Events aspect of the Biennale so special. The national pavilions in the Giardini are often so designed before the art even comes in to almost turn them into a gallery space, whereas a lot of the Collateral Events exhibitions, I think, really have to respond to the architecture as it exists, which of course was a challenge that I think you met with flying colors, and even we talked a lot about the patina of the materials, the wear of the materials, the layering, as well as the color, which I know is so important in your work. If you since I know you developed a couple pieces specifically for the show, if you wouldn't mind telling me a bit more about that process, that would be great.
Well, I started the show with the white painting that Robert was just showing, and this gray piece, and
Hmm.
these are the vestibule of the church. And I sent the white piece to the composer and said, this is how I'm going to start all of the paintings for this exhibition, and I'd like you to create music that goes with what you see and that emotion that you feel. Because we tried very much to make the art and the music the same emotion, so you could see it and you could hear it, and that would better the experience. And there were over 100,000 people through this exhibition over the 7 months it ran. So
Wow.
a great turnout.
Mhm. For sure. And you mentioned the music. We're sort of playing a little insider baseball here, I guess. So maybe if we could tell anyone listening a bit more about Greg Walter, the history of how you work together, and really his process for developing music to accompany your work in this installation.
Well, Greg and I were college friends, and he's a brilliant musician. He was in the original cast in Chicago of Forever Plaid, and he's toured with everyone from Patti LuPone to Chita Rivera. But Greg also is a brilliant musician. He's an assistant dean now at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, and we composed this entire exhibition via FaceTime. So I would send him a link with the paintings, and he would send me a thing with the music, and we would work on it back and forth. And I have very specific ideas about what I want, but I never want him to think that I'm telling him how to do music, because that's his thing. So I would say, I want things that sound very Philip Glass, like in the Hours. I wanted that repetition, and I wanted kind of a nocturne, which gives you that flow that happens in some of Chopin's music. But then I totally let Greg do what he wanted to do, and he started the piece opens up with a fugue, and for him that was there were snare drums that kind of go pop 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 pop, and it was mimic the idea of like bullets, because at that time we were going through everything. The big thing was immigration. Political unrest, immigration, and so he tried to capture that in the music. And then we refined it a bit as we went along, and even after we got to the church and installed everything, we were very lucky. Decibel gave us, they sponsored us and put an amazing grand piano, an electric grand piano in the space. So
Yeah.
things that were fantastic.
Well, this picture brings back the amazing memory of Greg's live performance during the opening, when he not only played the piano but also sang, and we discovered he's not only a great composer but has a fantastic voice. And we also learned that the acoustics in that hallway are remarkable. I know that the idea of the sound towards the end of the hall was always part of the processional concept, that when you're drawn into the space, you really feel like you're part of some sort of traditional march progression of a process, which was how you wanted people to view the paintings, but also how we discussed experiencing the space. So I think being able to have that special moment where he just stood alone right in the center and shared that talent was appreciated by everyone.
And that happened because I stayed for 6 weeks after the Biennale opened, and we decided, Greg and I, that we would not do regularly scheduled performances in the space. We just would show up, and if we had a crowd of 10 people or more, we would do a performance. And then what happened over time was we started getting visiting musicians come through, and they would do little improvs in the space. We had a Russian opera singer. We had a traveling choir group from Colorado State. We had a high school band from Sweden. And this happened almost every day. And to me, it was one of the most emotional, moving things that happened in the exhibition. I really loved that.
That's fantastic. When we talk so much right now, everyone kind of in the art world, about the experience of virtual versus real when viewing art and when coming together to view art, it's not even, that's obviously a large aspect of it. And even in the 5 minutes before we started this webinar, we were talking about obviously how different that experience is from looking at art on a screen or in a book even versus being there. But I do think that even what we're just talking about now, the practice of defining a space where art is taking place invites a platform for spontaneity that doesn't otherwise occur. No one's having a spontaneous, you know, musical performance pop up online if there isn't 50 million emails coordinating that. So I think I think that's something that people are missing now too. Beyond that, intimate experience one feels when seeing art, it's those moments that you can't anticipate until you're physically there, whether it's an incredible quick conversation or a performance like Greg's or a Swedish was it a high school band or a marching band? These are the kind of things where if we don't define there is something special happening here, are really never going to occur and bring people together in that way.
And I think that a space, especially a space like this, is almost like a costume for an actor. The costume on, the feeling that you have changes, and the vision changes. And like it was, if I remember correctly, it was your idea to do this as a processional. But I didn't think about that when we were setting this up. But as you went through the space, you came out, and the Andorran Pavilion was behind us, and the Zimbabwe Pavilion?
Yes, at the end.
So it was kind of perfect that people could come through our space and go out the back and go to the other spaces.
Yeah, I think the context of a sacred space, the natural long dimensions of the side chapel, and of course I think the scale and drama of your work invited that. I also feel that the concept of these figures as both establishing and breaking tradition tied into that idea in an interesting way, and that we were sort of forcing people a little bit to participate in some sort of a a tradition or a practice. But then, of course, they could break at any time. They could go in a different direction. They could go in and see one painting if they wanted. They could, come through the other way. So I feel that that again, it was one of these moments where the architecture is informing the art and vice versa, and I think it's just making both richer.
Right. Well, I think if it's cool with you, I would really like us to move on and talk about more current events and things.
Sure.
Robert, is that all right with you? I think we lost him. So
No, that's fine with me, except we have one question that just came in. Can you talk more about these paintings, Todd? You mentioned how you collaborated with Greg via FaceTime. How long did it take you to come up with the exhibition in your mind before creating the works? And can you just talk about that process a little bit?
It took me a while. When you start an exhibition, especially on this scale, it was so difficult because the cost to this was just almost more than one person could deal with. And trying to put it together, I got a lot of advice from everybody that I've ever worked with about, don't do this, do the money somewhere else, do this, do that. And then also about how the painting should look, because I kind of wanted them to change a little bit from my normal style. I wanted them to be more textured like the church, and I wanted to use some different materials. And I was advised by a lot of people that should not happen, that this was such a world stage, that people should see what I do. That's why I was invited to do this exhibition. So I stayed with that. And then I actually took the original imagery of the white painting came from a piece that I did for very dear friends of mine. And I used the main imagery in that to create the slash down the center. And for me, the slash is very much like a life force. So we were talking about one particular person in each of these paintings. So like this piece we're looking at now was based on my interpretation of who Elon Musk is. So the sword imagery is the life that he projects, how we see it as a people. We typically see these straight vertical lines as like a life force in a lot of paintings, and that goes back for centuries. And then I use blue to kind of convey the idea that Elon Musk is someone who works in his head, and he's in his head all the time. And he just had a child and named her AIX or something like that, or AXI. So he has very unusual ways of thinking and looking at things. So I tried to use that within this context as well. And also, this particular piece has a lot of upward movement because I wanted to show how he's really trying to move society into the 22nd century, with space travel and all the different train systems that he's working out and electric cars. But that was kind of the way each of these paintings was originally set up for me in the studio. And my studio is small. At the time, my studio was a 20 by 20, and I had 8 paintings that were bigger than 7 feet tall stacked up in my painting. I'd have to turn one painting to show another painting. So when Priscilla would come over, we would literally stack paintings to prop. That's what we were doing.
Moving before.
Yeah.
A little work.
As much a challenge just painting them all in my studio as it was to ship them and hang them in the church.
But you had that beautiful clerestory light in your studio, which in many ways was an incredible sort of mock-up scenario for the space that we ultimately had.
Yeah.
And how
that did help. And plus I had the outdoor space at that time, so I could take them outside and put them together in some semblance, because the church I believe the church was almost 90 feet long, but it was only 15 feet wide. So it's a difficult space to hang art in. And I remember you and I discussing the fact that if we hang the paintings across from each other, they might compete with each other because they were just too close together.
need those full 50 feet to take these in.
Yeah. Well, and then there were other things that happened that we didn't have a clue. I thought at the end of the chapel that was an altar table, and it was a reliquary with actual bones of somebody in it. So we had to, deal with that once we got there. I never did find out who the bones were, by the way.
we could have come up with something fun. But sorry, Todd, to get back to your, Robert, do you think, was that a sufficient answer or discussion, or?
Yes, that was perfect. Thank you. And once again, if there are any viewers with any questions, please feel free to submit them. We want to make this an interactive conversation as possible. Please use the Q&A function on your console. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that in moving the conversation forward, I think it's important that we discuss how foundations and artists work together, and how that is going to change completely going forward. Priscilla is with the MAK Center here in West Hollywood, and my studio is here in West Hollywood, and I'm also on the Arts Commission for the City of West Hollywood. So we work very closely together with the city works very closely with all of the different foundations and organizations. And I think it's going forward, we're going to have to work very closely together. I see for me dealing with my galleries, I've had to correct a couple of my gallerists a time or two already and say, things are different now. We have to work very closely together. You have to tell me what you're doing and what you need and let me help you. Because for me in the past, galleries have, this is their business and all you do is send them art. And I think one of the biggest changes is going to be that artists have to take more control of their careers, and in working with the galleries stronger. They have to have a presence that is more controlled going forward. But how do you think about that, Priscilla, especially with your foundation? Because you guys work on a small budget as well, and you do a lot of programming.
We have a tight budget. We have 3 exhibitions a year at the Schindler House. We have 4 exhibitions a year at the Mackey Apartments. And then we do numerous kind of short-term installations, events throughout the year. So it's a pretty robust program for, a staff of 5 in a relatively small institution. And all of our programming is funded by foundations or patrons or government grants. It really is entirely self-motivated and motivated by those concepts. So it is, it's never an artist just saying, I want to show this at the Schindler House, and us saying, great, here's the money to do it. It always has to be, I wish it were. But instead it's always, okay, well, what's your work? If we're not already familiar with it, usually we are. How do you see it why do you think it's necessary to have it shown in this context? What are the concepts driving your work? And then we sort of strategically decide, okay, well, what foundation, what group, what patron might be interested in that? Who's going to support that type of work? And also, does it make sense in the context of the architecture where we exhibit our work? I always joke that whether the curator or the artist likes it or not, the Schindler House is another curatorial voice, and you have to take that into consideration. I think it's all
you have low ceilings and you have a confined space in some ways.
It has so much character. It's not a white cube. It has all its history. It has all of its significance, and I don't think that's negative. I think that's always additive, frankly. It's not going to work with every art form. Similarly, I prefer working with foundations and grant programs that do have a point of view, and that have, maybe not too restrictive, but at least a hand in the process that contributes not only money. As you know, I have a call later today with West Hollywood, who are both supporting a show of ours that had to be delayed, that was supposed to open in May, called Demo. And it's actually about how 4 different artists look at the act of demolition, that we're now hoping to open in the fall. But recently, just before we had to close due to COVID, they supported an individual artist that we've been working with, Chris Emile, who did the first 2 iterations of this incredible performance series that we're hoping to bring back. So, we are very lucky to work and practice in a city that does support the arts, but not everyone has that luxury, and they allow a freedom. But I also know the types of projects that are going to appeal to versus whom I might approach, something that I would approach the NEA with, or the Graham Foundation, which is very architecture focused. And I do think that the more we think about funding art context, or venue and curator as a symbiotic relationship without too clear a hierarchy, the better chance we have of pulling things like this off, frankly.
And do you think I know I received an email from the Artist Relief, which is part of the Gottlieb Foundation and the Mellon Foundation and U.S. Artists Foundation for Contemporary Arts. They did a huge $10 million project to help artists, and I received an email from them that they had 55,000 applications in the round 1. They're doing 3 or 4 rounds, and they were able to give 500 grants. So wow. I'm wondering how, because this is affecting so many artists and so many levels and so many foundations. And do you think that how will this affect you guys going forward, and how you deal with raising your money? Because that's a really, really tough thing anyway, as I know personally here.
It is. Luckily for us, the grant process for exhibitions is usually a year out. So right now our program is funded through 2021, in part because we had to move everything back at least 3 months. But the relief funding that's being supplied, the artist relief funding, obviously we can't pursue. We can encourage the artists that we're working with to pursue that relief funding. But since we are a small business, we've had some success there. I know that the Getty has provided operational and payroll funds for small arts institutions, or provided opportunity to apply. We applied there. We'll see how that turns out. And we did receive some funding from the PPP system, which is really good, so that I can make sure that at least my employees are still being paid. The reality of the MAK Center and the Schindler House is that what we are ultimately is the stewards of these important works of architecture. And it's our main responsibility to keep the Schindler House open to the public. Obviously, right now we can't, but in general, that's kind of our baseline responsibility. So we always want to make sure that we have the funding to do that. Our ability to do events and programs beyond that is really just gravy. We feel that's equally our responsibility. But we do always see it as a win and a success when we're able to pull that off. And we have had 25 years of pulling it off, so we'd like to keep that going. But as I mentioned before, it's always this kind of quick and nimble aspect. But my understanding and speaking with other institutions is that it is operations like ours that have actually managed to weather the storm here a bit more successfully, because we're used to working this way. We're used to kind of project by project having to be strategic and flexible in our funding sourcing. And it's not that I think it's some of the bigger institutions that are being hit a bit harder.
It's going to be interesting going forward with all of these different things.
Certainly.
The questions just come in on the same topic of PPP and the COVID-19, Priscilla and Todd. What resources are out there right now for small institutions like yours, as well as artists like Todd? Because as we've heard in the news reports, a lot of artists really right now are struggling at best.
I think this will probably decimate the artist population. I think easily we're going to see numbers between 30 and 50% of the working artists not around in a year, because they're not going to be able to survive. Because most artists are not set up as a business, and if you're set up as a business, you can apply for similar money from the government, like disaster funding, which will help keep people alive until this starts coming back. But a lot of young artists don't do that. They just kind of paint and do shows, and they run month to month, and they're going to have a very difficult time going forward. And plus, it goes back to like the money that's available to artists, individual artists. 55,000 people applying the first round of artist relief. That's massive. And they're giving away small grants of like, I think they are $2,000 or $2,500. I can't even remember. So, they got, more than 50,000 people that didn't even get looked at. So that's how I would look at it from the artist standpoint. I'll throw it to you, Rebecca. Priscilla.
Yeah, I think I don't want to be too optimistic here, but I think it'll be a bit of a wake up call. I know we work with a lot of artists coming out of Europe at the MAK Center, and they're almost surprised sometimes by how little government funding exists for the arts and artists in the U.S. As I said, we're fortunate to be in West Hollywood, where we perhaps have an advantage there, but more in general in the U.S., that's very lacking. And certainly at times like this, when you do see funding, of course, this is really controversial right now with LACMA and the county funding. When you do see funding going towards the arts in the face of true disasters affecting people's health and livelihood, it's tough for people to wrap their head around hearing any sort of government funding going towards the arts. And yet, I think during this time more than ever, we've seen how dependent people are on entertainment, on something to take their mind off of what's going on. So we of course can argue both positions, and I can see both sides. But one might say more than ever, we need artists, we need creatives, we need people who uplift and take us outside of the day in and day out when things are so difficult. So it's I think I think it's going to hopefully influence and inspire a bigger discussion about funding of the arts, how it should work, and how integral it is to society.
Another question has just come in. How will you engage visitors and the art going forward once we open up after COVID-19? And that's a topic that we discussed actually before the broadcast. So I think it's quite interesting as well, from Todd's perspective and yours, Priscilla. How do you engage visitors with art in the age of social distancing?
Well, I personally find the virtual art experience to be a little lackluster, but I am specifically in the realm of art where site specificity is everything. But prior to the MAK Center, I worked largely with installation artists who were doing artwork that had to be experienced firsthand and in a very specific way. Whether you think about projects like Walter de Maria's Lightning Field, or most of Terrell's work, or incredible works like the Rothko Chapel. They're all so specifically about this artwork and this context, and the viewer's personal experience. So I find it hard to translate that type of art, which happens to be the type I'm most interested in, into a virtual experience. However, I think that so for the MAK Center in particular, we will have to be. I think it's more a matter of crowd control and creating with an eye towards art that's meant to be experienced in a very intimate way, versus changing our whole perspective. But on the broader scale, I think we can't ignore that, prior to this pandemic, art was art interests were already leaning towards the virtual. I mean, the winner and the gold and the silver prize winners of the Biennale that we participated in were both essentially video artworks, and performance, I think, was kind of cleaned up 2 years prior to that. So there has been this leaning towards art that can be shown in many different contexts, many different ways, translated, shifted digitally, communicated digitally. So I don't want to sound like a dinosaur. I'm certainly interested in that type of art too. It's just not specifically what we do at the MAK Center. So for me, maybe it's a bit more of a challenge than for other artists. But I do believe in one-on-one experience. I believe in the intimacy of showing art in the context of a home. I think that has a far different impact from in a gallery, from on a screen. So I feel that if it means we have to control numbers and be more strategic about timing, that's okay with me.
And that's correct, Priscilla. That's the beauty of the Schindler House, because the work is very intimate. You're able to walk around it. You get really close to the work, regardless of who you're exhibiting. That's just the beauty of the home. It's very intimate. It's very personal, and everything's on a normal scale. It's not a white cube.
Yeah, and I think that that was really driven home for me when we showed Edmund Duvall's work
Exactly.
at the end of 2018, I believe. And he was really adamant about not putting some of his ceramic pieces behind glass the way it would normally be shown. One specific installation he did in Pauline Schindler's studio. And I remember Gagosian was a little worried about, a little up in arms about that. But, he said this is a home. And when someone exhibits art in their home, they don't have that barricade. You are supposed to feel like you could touch it. You're not in a museum. And I think that was important to me. And, in working with Todd and how much he thinks about natural light in his work and how it hits the pieces at different times of day and different times of the season. I mean, this is something that I think most artists consider, and you don't get that from blasting artificial light in a white space. So we try to embrace that opportunity from both the artist's perspective and the house's perspective in how we exhibit.
I've worked for years on trying just to figure out how to photograph my work, because it never photographs the way it actually looks because of the layers and the way the light affects the work. And I think about that. If we're doing the show that I was supposed to do in New York, it was supposed to open May 2nd. So now I think it's going to be in the fall, but they want to do a virtual thing. And I'm not really sure how that's going to work as you do a walkthrough, especially with my work, with paintings. If you're doing an installation, you can get the feeling of what the installation is more easily than you can from paintings or certain things like I think. I also think that the art world has started to change a little bit. They're wanting art that's a little more personal. They're wanting something they can kind of touch and be a part of, as opposed to these massive installations that are a little impersonal. I think the world is going back to a place where it wants a more personal touch. It wants less of this impersonal and a little less of the Kardashians and a little more of like Family Man.
I agree that I agree with what Todd was saying about how young artists in particular and artists who are working artists will take a hit, unfortunately. But I hope that in the longer run, what we're saying more broadly about intimacy with art personal relationships with art will actually enhance the practice of those types of artists, because it they sell largely through personal relationships, and they sell largely, through somebody experiencing that artwork firsthand in a quiet and real way, or knowing the artist, already being familiar. Those types of artists are not, I think it's not a matter of, big name galleries or huge art fairs. And so my hope is that this kind of forced time of quiet, this forced time of introspection, will make people really think about, well, why do I care about art, and why do I collect it? Why, especially perhaps when money's tight, am I still interested in obtaining artwork? And I think that the answer will not be to hit some, check some box or impress somebody else, but really what's going to fulfill me at the end of the day. And hopefully not immediately, I'm sure, but perhaps a year down the road, that will actually bring a greater sense of fulfillment and accomplishment when we collect something that it's our personal opinion has value, and not somebody telling us has value.
Yeah, I think so as well. I kept hearing, when all of this first started happening, the news was all about the big institutions and auctions. And, for the most part, big institutions and auctions don't affect but the 1% of the 1% of the artists in the world, or even foundations for that matter. And I couldn't quite figure out how no one was touching on how this is going to affect the average everyday artist who works and make a living doing this, but they don't work with Gagosian or the Met. It's a completely different world than that. And even though I know that kind of drives the economy in many, many ways, it's really not responsible for most artists in any way. It doesn't do anything for them. It doesn't further their career. It doesn't help them with the projects they're doing. It's just a way of making money for that very high-end group. I don't know why I brought that up. It just annoys me sometimes.
I think that it's what we're all thinking about when we think about our neighborhoods and our friends, the small restaurants in our neighborhoods versus the big ones that are going to survive this. And yes, they will be hurt in the immediate sense, but the hope is that we'll come out of it realizing how much we want to support those smaller, more personal efforts moving forward.
Yeah.
So another question has come in from Cynthia. She wants to know, Todd, how was your experience with dealing with spaces of ancient architecture?
Oh, I think it's amazing. I love that. It presented, like we discussed earlier, it presented some difficulties that really kind of threw me off the cliff when I first got the contract with the church about you literally could not use nails or glue or string or anything within the architecture. And then while I was hanging the art, the city of Venice has their architect come through and check the space. And if they had found that I had put a nail up anywhere, they would fine me. And it was a huge 20,000 euro fine, but I didn't. So they have photos of every single hole that's in the wall. And I found that for me, the space was very, it was amazing. It was very inspirational, but it was also great to work with someone like Priscilla, because Priscilla understands the space better. So when we were discussing the curatorial aspects of what this exhibition could be, the symbiosis that happened was really amazing, because we could sit on the side of my patio and discuss ideas, and they would congeal very quickly when we were throwing this together, just based on images of what the chapel looked like.
And I think bringing, also Todd bringing in Greg was great, because sound will hang anywhere. We don't need any for that.
Well, Greg had such an amazing experience as well, because Greg's just been teaching for the past 10 years. And so when we've done several shows together, we did one with Art 1307 in Naples, was our first fairly large music and art exhibition. And that was in a 17th century ancient home in Naples, and we had we had to pipe everything in because once again it gets back to money, but we had everything recorded, and then we hired a cellist, and then Greg was able to get one of the mezzo soprano that also teaches at the University of North Carolina flew in, and so she and Greg sang. And it was a pretty amazing thing because we could combine the three live voices, the Greg, Janine, and then the cellist, along with the recorded music. And it was amazing, which is very much what we did in Venice.
I mean, I think Cynthia's question is great because it does, I mean, it not to be too cheesy, but it really does hearken to, I think, the core of this experience and this process, which is, you have these ancient buildings and ancient architectures, and things come and they go, and they leave some form of imprint. But mostly the imprint is on the people who came through and had that experience. And I feel that that our takeaway from being in an ancient space was feeling like our moment there or our time there will last, far beyond the 6 months of the Biennale.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. It was, I think, probably the most stressful year of my life. One of the most incredible experiences, because once I got there, we pretty much just allowed things to happen. I allowed myself to let the control go. Once the exhibition was set up, everything was there. There really wasn't a whole lot that we could control. And we had all kinds of crazy things, like the church flooded, and it got up to, like in this particular photo, it got up almost to the bottom of that line on the wall. So some of the lighting was destroyed. The speakers had to be fixed. So who could foresee a flood? There was like 100-year flood in Venice. They haven't had things like that in 100 years. We dealt with just things.
Well, Cynthia responded back. She said it's a wonderful experience for all of us, and I totally agree with her on that. It was really wonderful. The opening week, especially, I think you said we had 10,000 people that first week alone who came and saw the exhibition, and just the crowds that came in and the reaction. And I'll never forget when the priests from the church came in and they loved the exhibition. So talk about that. Talk about that, Todd, if you don't mind, because that was wonderful to hear them oohing and wowing over the show.
Well, I think the church creates a reverence. It's almost like the Rothko Chapel creates this reverence, and when you're there, you feel small, and the space here creates that same emotion when you're in there, and with the music playing, and we played it a little bit loud because I wanted it to be just slightly uncomfortable for people. Even though the music was very beautiful, I wanted it to be loud so you really felt the music when it would swell and it would kind of shake your body a little bit. But like this particular piece that you're showing now, the gray piece, was one of them that we did to kind of discuss Pope Francis, because I think he is one of those new apostles in the world right now. He's trying to make changes as best he can, and he's dealing with an institution that is, very much the ideology has been set for centuries, and it's very hard to change something like that, no matter whether you're talking about a city or a church or a political system. And I thought it was interesting that the priest felt that, and they picked up on it, and they wanted to experience it more, and it meant a lot to me. For me, some of the best times were to walk in, and there would be two people in the chapel, and they would sit in the chairs, and they would stay for 45 minutes just sitting and listening to the music and the art, and they come out crying. They didn't know who I was, because I just sat, like I'd let the attendant leave, and I would sit there, and they would be crying. And of this exhibition, I think it was also interesting because it was such a juxtaposition against most of the art of the Biennale, because the Biennale there was a lot of in-your-face art, because this was the idea that Ralph Rugoff had was really more about the political uncertainty going on right now. And then we kind of took a different way of showing that. And with just the paintings, the music, you couldn't have been much more simple.
No, you're correct. Cynthia follows up, Todd. Can you talk about how Venice changed your way of painting and your old style?
For me, I think it was so many of the things that happened last year. There was a place when I finally got home from Venice, because I was in Europe for almost 4.5 or 5 months over the course of the year. It was a very intense year. And then when I came home, I finally had the chance to sit and just kind of take in everything that had happened, and having the Pollock Krasner Foundation support this very 100%. They were there. The board showed up. They gave me money for this exhibition. They have been very vocally supportive of the exhibition. And then winning the Pollock Prize and working with Priscilla, and I kind of came home, and it gave me a confidence in what I'm doing that has allowed me to take out some of the control issues that I deal with in my work. Because for me, the lines in my work are control. And so the new paintings have almost lost those. They're much more just an expressionist piece, and they've taken on more of, I'm very much influenced by the late 40s, 50s, 60s abstract movement in New York and in Europe. But that's what I find was the most interesting. And the timing is very similar, because artists were doing a similar thing that we're going to go through now, because artists were buck the system that was going on in the big galleries and the control that they had, and how little artists had in their own careers. And so you had people just doing, well, this is what I want to do, and it doesn't matter. And I think that it was a really important thing. But anyway, back to the question, for me, I think it just gave me a confidence that I can now go for it and do what I want to do. So I do things that I want to do. I paint the way I feel. I paint. I don't. Most of the time I kind of project it in my brain as hanging on the walls at my house, not somewhere else. And then even if I'm doing an entire series of pieces, I want them to be what moves me and nothing else. And I think that was a huge step for me as an artist.
And I think that's a great point to end on. So thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Todd, for a very interesting discussion today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well.